Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Hello, hello, hello. I'm back, and it's only been a couple days since I did my last video. And, I'm cold. In the garage, no heat, no air conditioning. Generally don't need the air conditioning. It's not cold enough to see my breath. It's just, I could have done this during the day, and it would have been a bit warmer. I'm shivering. I haven't been out here. If I've been out here a few minutes longer, I probably would have acclimated a bit more to the temps. But I just, how I say, I'm pretty unprepared for a video. But this one is like even less prepared, if that's possible, than my others. I literally just came out here, turned on the computer, and started recording. I didn't gather up any records to show or anything. I talked about Don and Dave Grusin a couple videos back, and I've still been listening to their stuff, and mainly in the car. I was just listening to some of those old Don Grusin albums at home. Believe it or not, been listening to the System 7, the Steve Hillage techno stuff, because I pulled all those CDs out, and even bought a couple of their older albums recently. There's not a lot to say about them. There's a lot of sameness between the albums, but some of the albums are naturally slightly better than others, but, it's kind of a formula. But for whatever reason, I got interested in catching that era of Steve Hillage's music. I'm cold, Usually when I do a video, I'm out here for a good amount of time, a half hour, sometimes more, before I actually film. And when it's cold, I get used to the temperatures. Tonight, I just decided, I don't think the upstairs neighbors, who are pretty much the only people that would be able to ever hear me at all, I don't think they're home tonight. I haven't heard any walking around or anything. I don't like filming during the day. I've talked about that before, so I'm here. It's about 10 p.m. my time, 10 o'clock in the evening, which is a time that I like to record and talk about music. But like I said, I literally came out here and just turned on the computer and started the camera going here within a few minutes of being out here. So I haven't quite got used to how cold it is here yet. So with no content, with nobody, with nothing to specifically show or talk about, I thought the one thing I would do, which I want to do on a semi-regular basis anyway, is just do vinyl pulls and randomly select albums from my collection. And right around the time, just after I did my last video, I actually brought a random batch of vinyl out here and filled in a gap back there that I had, so that whole shelf is full now of more vinyl albums than I had before out there to choose from. And hopefully I won't keep picking out just Klaus Schulze and ECM albums, though I'm thinking that that batch that I pulled out there, that I just brought out there, there's probably a lot of ECM albums in there. I'm cold. So, I'm going to continue to do the Tales from the Garage as long as possible, and then I'll be inside. It looks like it's coming to an end, because certainly by January it's definitely going to be too cold, and we only got, maybe 3 weeks, about 3 weeks till December's over, and I'm thinking, by the end of December it's going to be way too cold. So I'll be filming videos inside, other rooms in the house that have heat. But I won't be able to do any kind of vinyl pulls. Everything else I could do there. But all the vinyl I have is on the floor and not set up so that I could kind of do a random selection where I can't tell what I'm picking. I have the spines facing in the other direction, so I can't, when I do a vinyl pull there, I can't see what I'm pulling intentionally. So, this is probably my first video of only vinyl pulls. So I'm going to keep this one under, I promised to keep this one under 10 and a half hours. So I'm just going to select something. Well, I think this is from the ones that I just pulled out and added to the selection, but nonetheless it's an ECM album. The late great John Abercrombie, whose death I still have not gotten over. I still have not I still have not properly been able to process his passing. And this is one I bought. This is an album called Night, and I bought this as a new release. It was recorded in April '84, probably came out in late '84, and probably very late in '84. I want to say maybe like December. So there was a time, it was around this time, that I was heavily into ECM, and I was buying a lot of new releases. And at that time, I had timed their releases based on the recording date, because they always listed what month an album was recorded. And it seemed to take 8 months from the time an album was recorded till the time it hit the shelves, at least here in America. And that was something that stayed true for several years. It's not the case anymore. Albums seem to take a lot longer to reach the marketplace. But there was this period of about 8 months, because back then they would record the albums, throw the package together, and release it right away. Nowadays, it seems like they spend a lot more time either with the package or just putting the albums out in general. So this probably would have come out probably around sometime like December. Fitting, it's December now of '84. And this was a very, very slick album. I can appreciate it now, but I'd say I wouldn't say I didn't like it at the time, but it was a bit too slick. And this is, to my mind, I'm thinking probably Night was probably the most commercial album he ever made, as a leader, certainly. It starts off with Ether Reggae, which is John Abercrombie playing a very electric reggae tune. Now, this has no bassist on here. It's Jan Hammer on keyboards and Jack DeJohnette on drums and Mike Brecker on saxophone. So this was a little bit of kind of a regrouping to look back maybe on the Timeless album, which was considered a classic and John Abercrombie's first solo album, also on ECM from, what is that, '74, I want to say. So he gathered the Timeless band, which is the only other time he recorded with them, with Jan Hammer on keyboards, Jack DeJohnette on drums, except he added Mike Brecker to saxophone. I'm not sure, I haven't spun this for probably just a few months ago. I was listening to this. I don't think Brecker's on every track. There's only 6 tracks on here. It's a relatively short album, right around 40 minutes. But Ether Reggae is a very commercial song. It's the one track on here that wasn't written by John Abercrombie. It's a Jan Hammer composition. But this album doesn't really recall the Timeless album at all. Timeless was more of a cross between 70s jazz fusion, a couple acoustic tracks, which are actually my favorite tracks off the Timeless album, and then the title track, Timeless, which was more of a ethereal kind of, almost like a new age track back then. This is probably the slickest and certainly the most commercial John Abercrombie album, I think, that he made as a leader. So at first I was kind of disappointed, because I was, always, and continue to always kind of hope that he would do more albums like Characters or Sargasso Sea, or with in a band context, like his first quartet with Richie Bayrock on piano, that kind of more pretty but quiet impressionistic music. And this sounded very commercial to me. And his next album was also a very slick, very electric sounding album, but had that same slick electronic, very, I don't want to say 80s digital, but that kind of is in the mix there. And John did play a lot of guitar synthesizer at that time, which I liked. I liked the colors that he used on the guitar synthesizer. So I don't blame the commercial bent of the recording on the fact that he was using a guitar synthesizer. I just think it's he was looking at a almost maybe like a more modern sound at that time, or maybe more modern fusion sound or something. He only did it for a couple albums. This album and maybe the follow-up, was it Going There, I think is the title of it. Then he started, he dropped the guitar synthesizer. I don't think that's what the problem was. I thought it was a mindset maybe at the time to maybe make slightly more commercial recordings or slick recordings. This is something that would probably appeal to fans of the very electric era of something like Steps Ahead that was going on at the time, which Mike Brecker was a part of as well. After the first Steps Ahead album, which was mainly acoustic, they got more electronic and a little more fusion-y and very, very slick, and dropped the acoustic bass for electric bass and stuff like that. And I think this might appeal more to maybe to fans of the Steps Ahead, the more electric era, even when Mike Brecker was still in the band. Okay, so I'm going to do another vinyl pull, because I do have to keep this under 10.5 hours, because people have complained that they have trouble watching a 10.5 hour video, if you can imagine such a thing. I shouldn't have done this. I should not have pulled another selection from the same area. Okay, I was just watching. My computer just froze, so I think there may be some freezing action or something going on, and the video may be what's known in the technical world as funky. So I don't know what's going on with the video. But this computer has generally not had too many problems recording videos, but I just saw the screen freeze, so I don't know. My voice may be speeding up, slowing down, whatever. So anyway, I pulled probably too close to the last pull, and I pulled another John Abercrombie album, M, which this is an album I love. This is an album that I thought was never going to see the light of day on CD, and it just did within the last couple of years. There were 3 albums that John Abercrombie made with a quartet with Richie Byrock, which I was just talking about, on piano, George Mraz on upright bass, and Peter Donald on drums. Peter Donald actually quit the music business, I read, and I think he became a teacher. I want to say history teacher, which is probably why I haven't seen his name pop up. George Mraz continued to play music, as Richie Byrock does. But this is John's first really working band. His previous solo albums were bands that gatherings of musicians, really, that he had just put together to record that album and not necessarily tour with. This was the first band that he had, which lasted for 3 years in the late, around 78 to sometime around in the early 80s, around 81 or so. Recorded 3 albums, all of which I love and are excellent, and one of which initially just got released in Japan on CD from 1978, and that was really an expensive import that my buddy Carm bought me a copy of when that came out, which was really nice. And subsequently, though, ECM finally, a couple years ago, released a box set with all 3 recordings of this band. No personnel changes. The quartet stayed the same throughout the 3-album history of about 3 years or so, the 3 or 4 years. This was their last one? I want to say this is the last one, recorded November 1980, which I bought as a new release. It would have come out in 81, probably like mid 81 in the summertime. And great. This is a great album. I can't pick all 3 albums with the quartet are so good that I can't pick a favorite. For years I thought this was my favorite, and I started listening to the other 2, and I'm like, well, no. They have one just called Abercrombie Quartet, the previous album, recorded in '79, which a lot of times I think might be my favorite as well. But then there's the first one in '78, which is the quietest and most impressionistic of the batch, which I love, and the most low key certainly, but really pretty. So it's really hard to pick. And on these albums, John Abercrombie wrote about half the tunes, with Richie Byrock, the pianist, just plays acoustic piano, writing the other half of the tunes. This is the only album that had a piece also written by bassist George Mraz, the last piece on here called Pebbles. And it's a track I really love, and I wish, after hearing it, that George, that the quartet had stayed together longer and George contributed more writing. It's almost a minimalistic pattern-based song that very much fits the vibe of what the band does, but is in a slightly different direction compositionally, maybe, than the tracks that John Abercrombie and Richie Bayrock wrote. So it makes me wish that Mraz had done more composing and that the band had stayed together longer. This was a great album. I'm so glad they finally released it on CD, because the introduction to the first track on side one, called Boat Song, is very, very quiet. And, the vinyl's worn. And, the place, at least for my records, where the worn vinyl is mostly heard with the little pops and things like that, is always at the beginning of each side. And, of course, this would be the most quietest thing on the entire album. And so I was so thrilled when it finally came out on CD that I could hear that. It's a couple minutes of really quiet, little electric guitar, kind of experimental noodling thing going on. And John also plays acoustic guitar on here as well, which he doesn't do a lot on a lot of his albums. To me, it's always a treat to hear him play acoustic guitar. And it's strange that they don't credit the electric mandolin on here. But he must play it on, I have to run through the songs in my head. He must play the mandolin, because he was still playing the electric mandolin at this point. And it was almost like his signature sound, to the extent that a lot of people thought that the electric mandolin was a guitar. I've read a lot of reviews on Abercrombie's various recordings from the 70s into the early 80s, and at that time he was using mandolin on this electric mandolin on pretty much everything he recorded as leader, but even as a sideman. And a lot of people in reviews mentioning themes or little improvisations or something like that are played on the mandolin, and they're identifying them as playing on guitar, but they're not. They're actually played on mandolin. And what became his signature sound, which to me was his most, I think this is really his defining period. His early stuff had a little bit, just in the first couple of albums, a little bit of a fusion edge to them, a little distorted guitar, maybe not totally original, still coming out of that mid-70s, John McLaughlin fusion, Return to Forever fusion thing too. But to me, as soon as he dropped the distortion, he really developed an interesting, unique sound, and part of on the guitar using a very clean tone. But part of that sound, or a big part of that sound, was how much he overdubbed, especially the electric mandolin. And his main thing is if he was playing the main melody of a track, which he usually did on the guitar, he would overdub the mandolin, kind of doubling the melody or playing harmonies with the melody. So a lot or most of the time, when you hear the melody of a track, you hear it played on guitar, but you hear this other thing that sounds also like a guitar played on the higher end, doubling the melody. And it's actually his mandolin, his electric mandolin. And that really became a defining sound for him. And I think this was a period when he was most defined by his sound, which I loved. And oddly enough, when he got into guitar synthesizers, I was sad to see him drop the mandolin, which was strange. And then he dropped the guitar synthesizers, and his guitar tone changed after that. And it wasn't as original, I don't think. And I didn't care for his tone as much. I still liked his albums and his playing. But oddly enough, when he dropped the guitar synthesizer, he did not go back to playing the mandolin. That may have been a practical reason, because I know he had a house fire, and it was probably somewhere around that time, possibly when he was still using the guitar synthesizer, and he lost all his instruments in a house fire, and I believe that included the electric mandolin, because he never played it again. I never heard him play electric mandolin again. And after that period, going into, I want to say the late 80s, early 90s, All I ever saw him play was electric guitar, and there's many photos of him playing guitar, and it seems like he didn't even settle on a specific electric guitar. It seems like he was trying out a lot of electric guitars and kind of changing his sound a little bit, or quite a bit actually. So for me, this period of the mid '70s to the mid '80s was his prime period, but especially when he was using the mandolin. Let me just pick another one. Well, here's a weird one. Okay, I'm glad I didn't go back to that same section because it's for fear of picking out another Abercrombie one. Here's an album I haven't listened to for so many years. I really can't talk much about it. All I can talk about is my mindset when I bought it, and that is The Best of Debbie Gibson. Oh no, wait a minute. I left that back there. So a few years after I got into ECM, and I was kind of doing, I was expanding my horizons and trying to absorb and discover what's out there in terms of the music world. I had already, discovered the whole electronic European Berlin thing going on years before, and the ECM thing, and then I went, into the mainstream jazz thing, and and the Wes Montgomerys of the world, and the Coltranes, and the whole '60s, Sonny Rollins, and blah blah blah, Miles Davis, period, Eric Dolphy, whoever. And I also started wanting to expand out beyond that, so I started buying various classical music albums and also ethnic music albums like Chinese music and stuff like that. So here's one that I bought. It's on the. I'm curious as to whether. I tried to keep my receipts for many of my albums. But because I bought multiple albums at one time, there's only one receipt. And I guess I don't have the receipt for this. But here's something from the None Such Explorer series, which people that are, I guess, familiar with world music and folk world music, it's a very famous label and series of recordings. And this is the Village Music of Bulgaria. I remember picking this up. I can't speak much about the record because I haven't played it in years, but it's Bulgarian songs and dances from different regions, and it was recorded with the assistance and cooperation of the Music Institute of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences and the Bulgarian Committee for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries. And there's vocalists on here. Some oddball stringed instruments, which is the thing I think that really is probably what I saw that made me want to buy it. But in general, I was just trying to expand my horizons and hoping to hear something that sounded really different to me and really foreign. And I can see there's a guy holding here something that looks like a kind of like a mandolin with a bow, and for seeing that, called a gadulka, which is an instrument I haven't encountered since, so I'm not familiar with it. If you can see it there. And it looks like an instrument that I'm still very curious now as to what it sounds like. I love, for instance, Chinese musical instruments, especially bowed instruments. And so the gadulka looks like it might be some equivalent Bulgarian folk type of instrument, similar to a violin, or like the Chinese violin, which only has 2 strings. I'm looking for a year. The whole thing just looks like something that's fairly old. And there's, the thing I like about these is, the substantial liner notes, which are small, but a lot of information there. And I didn't play this a lot, so it probably was something that didn't exactly float my boat. And here's an insert that came with it, though. 2-sided insert. It's interesting that in all this information that's on here, though, I'm not seeing a recording date. So pieces for singers, a lot of singers on here, which may be why it didn't get maybe a lot of spins from me. One piece is for two singers. Something called a kaval, which was an instrument used by shepherds for hundreds of years and is a typical instrument of Thrace or Thrace, which is, I guess, a region of Bulgaria. I know nothing about Bulgaria. It must be a wind instrument because the technique can sustain long, complex phrases with a single breath. But the other pieces, some of which have that gadulka and a tambura, which is an Indian instrument. A lot of pieces for singers on here, though, I see. But this is just one of those things that only VC members would understand, because, you know, people that are, you know, heavily into music go out and they buy these oddball things because they look interesting, not because they have any familiarity with the music on them and they want to explore and hear different things. Only hardcore music fans would buy this kind of thing. And the None Such Explorers series is a very well respected series. It's, you know, made in the U.S. At least at the time, None Such Records was based in New York. I'm not sure if they still are. Which makes me kind of curious. I'm going to, you know, if my turntable was in better working condition, I would certainly play this without hesitation. But I might just look on YouTube to see if maybe the album's up there, or I can hear some of the music at least, or some of these interesting looking instruments. So it's, you know, it's one of those things that only hardcore music fans know, that sometimes we go out on a limb, because this was one of the more oddball purchases that I make of, as far as knowing nothing about really what this music was like, or what it was going to sound like, or having any familiarity at all with even the instruments. So I'm going to pull one more. Well, wouldn't you know it, another ECM. How many ECMs did I pick? 1, 2. Okay, out of 4 albums, I got 3 ECMs. I want to say Carm, somebody brought this up recently. I think. I remember somebody doing a video on Gary Peacock, the bassist, who thankfully is still with us and still recording and has a recent new album out. Here's one of his ECM albums. What a surprise. Recorded in February 77, so it would have come out late in 77. And an album called Tales of Another. And yeah, I'm pretty sure Carm showed this, because I remember us having conversations about Gary Peacock with the mustache, which I don't think he had for very long. I don't recall seeing a lot of pictures of Gary Peacock with the mustache, and he looks like a tough guy, like you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley somewhere when he had the mustache. And strangely, without the mustache, he doesn't look at all that imposing. But an interesting album, because if you're familiar with the Standards trio of Keith Jarrett and Jack DeJohnette on drums and Gary Peacock on bass, that's been an ongoing thing for decades now, pretty much since the early 80s. This was the first time that these 3 guys got together to record an album. Not as the Standards trio, but basically Gary went to Jack DeJohnette and Keith Jarrett just to be his trio, his band for this recording of all Gary Peacock compositions. So it's very different. If you know what the Standards trio sounds like, it's very different from that, but even different from the Standards trio albums, to me, that are the most interesting are not the ones that they record the standards on, but the ones when they go do their own pieces. Generally, when they record things that aren't standards, they're generally group improvisations, which can go on for a half hour or more. And I find those interesting, even if they're not entirely successful all the time. And, you know, this is maybe closer to those group improvisations, but even different from that. So even with these same 3 musicians, you've got quite a different thing going on, because there's 6 tracks on here. All of them are compositions by Gary Peacock, and they're all in the standard jazz mode, where there's a theme and then there's improvisations going on after that. But this one's a little bit more angular, not pretty, you know, not pretty like, say, the standard stuff would be. Gary Peacock has a very interesting writing style, compositional style. And all of his albums as a leader are quite interesting and not what you expect. And sometimes this was a little hard to get into for me initially. And this is probably one of the more difficult ones made with this group of musicians to get into. It takes a little bit of time. Oh, that oddball. This reminds me of like a physical, a tile. Like you would make an art class or something like that. Three-dimensional tile with the raised things on there. It reminds me of something I would have done in art class like in the 1970s. But this I also bought on CD. I'm pretty sure I must have this on CD. Yeah, I do. Good album. Another album that I bought. Maybe not close to its release. Maybe a couple years after it came out. But so that's a half hour, and I only pulled out 4 albums. I thought I would get through more, but I'm going to cut this 10 hours short, and just do another one, weather permitting. I have to look at I'll watch the weather forecast to and see if they're predicting any slightly warmer days. I've warmed up a little bit. I'm not quite shivering, but it's still cool out here, but not unbearable. So I'll unless the temperature really dips here, I definitely should be back and do more and do hopefully even shorter one where I can get some more vinyl pulls, and maybe not everything will be ECM. Maybe I don't know if I should actually go into that collection and just purge some ECM out of there. I don't know if I want to do that. And put in other oddball things kind of at random, but I don't know. And for now I'm going to leave it. I'll leave it for this season, and then when we'll see what happens when I have to leave here and wait for the warmer weather to come back in. I'm going to have a lapse of a couple months there, at least when I can't do videos out here. So hope everybody's doing well. Thanks for watching my videos. I appreciate it, and I'll be back soon.